Under the sterile light of the hospital, time seemed to dissolve into a single trembling instant. Finn stood frozen beside Hope's bed, his pulse hammering against his ribs, as the words from the nurse reached him like distant echoes. "Hope's losing blood fast. We don't have a match on file." The room blurred for a moment, everything reduced to the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the pale stillness of the woman lying beneath the thin white sheet. Acting on instinct rather than reason, he offered his arm before anyone could ask. The moment his blood began to flow into her veins, something inside him stirred, an inexplicable recognition, a sense of connection that reached deeper than medicine, deeper than duty. And when the crisis passed, when her heartbeat steadied and color began to return to her face, he should have felt relief. But what he felt was unease, sharp, cold, and growing. The test results confirmed what intuition had whispered. Their blood types were not just compatible, they were identical. That detail gnawed at him relentlessly. Identical blood type was possible by coincidence, but the odds were slim, and Finn, as a doctor, knew the math too well to dismiss it as chance. He ordered an additional test under the guise of medical curiosity, though his heart already knew where it would lead. When the DNA report arrived, its crisp black letters carved open his world. The genetic markers aligned in ways that made denial impossible. Hope Logan shared his bloodline. They weren't distant relatives or accidental matches. They were connected by something fundamental and irreversible. A single phrase burned in his mind: half-siblings. The room seemed to tilt as he stared at the document, each line slicing through years of certainty about who he was. The first name that came to him, unbidden, inevitable, was Sheila. The woman who had haunted every corner of his adult life, the shadow who never stopped reaching for him even after he severed every tie. She had lied before, manipulated, destroyed lives for her own desires. Was it possible that she had lied about his paternity as well? If Jack wasn't his biological father, then who was? And more importantly, who was Hope's father? The realization struck him like lightning. This truth didn't just alter his past, it rewrote it entirely. Every word Sheila ever told him came rushing back, layered with new meaning. He drove to her apartment in a haze, the paper still trembling in his hand. His mind oscillated between fury and disbelief, between the urge to scream and the need to understand. When he confronted Sheila, she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at him with that unsettling calm that always preceded her confessions. Her eyes glistened, not with guilt, but with something disturbingly close to pride. She spoke of a past encounter, a moment she once claimed to have forgotten, one that linked her to the same man who fathered Hope. The revelation was as grotesque as it was tragic. It meant that all the tangled lines of betrayal, love, and rivalry that had defined their lives were rooted in a single act of deception. As Finn listened, the weight of what she had done crushed the air from his lungs. The woman he had fought to keep out of his life had once again made herself inescapable, not through violence this time, but through blood. He was now bound to her not only by birth, but by a shared legacy of destruction. The knowledge that Hope, the woman who had trusted him, who had once turned to him for guidance and comfort, was his sister, tore at his conscience. Every moment they had shared replayed in his memory with a new, unbearable undertone. How could he tell her? How could he face her when she woke and explain that the man who had saved her life might also be the embodiment of her deepest nightmare? When Hope opened her eyes days later, the world she returned to was one that had shifted in her absence. She saw Finn sitting at her bedside, the fatigue etched into his face, the silence around him too deliberate to be casual. He was not just her doctor anymore. He was the keeper of a secret that had the power to destroy everything. The light between them, once soft and familiar, had turned heavy. And though he wanted to tell her, wanted to ease the burden by sharing it, he found himself trapped in a moral labyrinth. To tell the truth would be to inflict irreparable pain, to force her into a reality built on betrayal. Yet to remain silent would be another form of cruelty, a lie that would rot both their consciences from the inside. Outside her room, Finn's mind replayed the night he learned the truth, the way Sheila's voice trembled not with remorse, but with justification. She had called it destiny, as if bloodlines were excuses for chaos. He remembered the faint smile on her lips when she said, "You were never meant to belong to them, Finn. You were always mine." Those words had once filled him with revulsion. Now they echoed like a prophecy. The thought that he shared DNA with Sheila was enough to make him sick, but the idea that Hope did too, that her life was intertwined with his through that same woman's choices, made his heart fracture. Hope, still recovering, began to sense that something was wrong. She felt it in the way Finn avoided her gaze, in the way he lingered by the door instead of the bed. The gratitude she felt for him saving her life began to blur into confusion. Why did he look at her as if she were a reflection of some haunting truth he couldn't face? Her instincts told her the answer was close, but her body was still too weak to pursue it. And Finn, for all his integrity, couldn't bring himself to tell her while she lay fragile and unaware of how deeply her existence was now entangled with his. Days passed like ghosts, each one marked by silence. Finn isolated himself in the lab, running tests he no longer needed to run, hoping that science would somehow rewrite the truth. He imagined calling Jack, demanding answers, but he knew the devastation that would follow. If Jack wasn't his real father, then the foundation of his entire family, the moral compass he clung to, would collapse. And if the man Sheila spoke of truly fathered both him and Hope, then the tangled web extended beyond anything he could control. In his solitude, Finn began to question everything he thought he knew about family, love, and destiny. He had always believed that truth, no matter how painful, was redemptive, that it was better to live in the light than in comforting illusions. But now, standing at the edge of revelation, he realized some truths didn't liberate, they consumed. If he told Hope, it could destroy her trust in her mother, in the memory of her father, in every certainty that grounded her. Yet, keeping it secret meant he would have to live with a lie every time he looked at her, every time she thanked him for saving her life. When Hope finally recovered enough to leave the hospital, she invited Finn to her home, unaware that his heart was a battlefield. The sight of her, alive, radiant, unscarred by the truth, only deepened his torment. He wanted to preserve that innocence, to keep her untouched by the darkness that had invaded his life. But secrets have a gravity of their own, and soon they began to pull both of them downward. Hope's intuition sharpened. She noticed the tremor in Finn's voice, the unfinished sentences, the haunted pauses. She began to wonder if her accident had triggered something more profound than physical healing, if Finn's life had changed in ways she wasn't meant to understand. Then one afternoon, while searching for her medical file to confirm something trivial, Hope stumbled upon the DNA report Finn had hidden. It was like stepping into a mirror and finding someone else's reflection staring back. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't process the words. The document was simple, clinical, without emotion, but its implications were catastrophic. Genetic match, 49.8% probability of sibling relation. The world around her tilted. Every memory with Finn, the laughter, the gratitude, the strange sense of familiarity, crashed into her like a wave of fire. She understood now why he had looked at her the way he did. The truth wasn't just scientific, it was human, devastatingly human. When Finn arrived at her door later that evening, he saw the paper trembling in her hands before she said a word. The confrontation he had feared was already unfolding in her eyes. Though she didn't scream or accuse, the silence between them was louder than any outburst. In that silence lived every question she couldn't voice. How could you hide this? How could you let me believe we were strangers when blood bound us this way? Finn wanted to explain that he had only meant to protect her, that he hadn't known how to speak a truth so corrosive. But the look on her face told him it was too late. The damage had been done, not by the revelation itself, but by the delay. Hope retreated inward in the days that followed, her mind looping through the implications. If Finn was her brother, it meant that Sheila Carter, was part of her bloodline. The woman who had tormented her family for years, the one she blamed for so much pain, was now inescapably part of her. The shame and confusion twisted together until she could barely breathe. It was one thing to know evil from the outside. It was another to find it written in your own DNA. For Finn, guilt became a living thing. He couldn't sleep without seeing Hope's eyes, the mixture of betrayal and disbelief that had shattered him. Every time he passed a mirror, he saw Sheila's ghost staring back. He wondered if this was her final victory, not through manipulation, but through inheritance. She had managed to infect their lives in the most intimate way imaginable. And as much as he wanted to destroy her for what she had done, a small part of him couldn't help but see the reflection of himself in her. The defiance, the restlessness, the need to control what fate had already written. In the end, both Finn and Hope were left standing on opposite sides of a truth too heavy for either to carry. Their lives had been intertwined by accident, but their pain was deliberate, carved by the choices of others who had played God with their destinies. The knowledge of their shared blood became a curse neither could escape. For Hope, it was the collapse of identity. For Finn, it was the death of certainty. And hovering above them, unseen but omnipresent, was Sheila, the architect of their ruin, smiling somewhere in the dark, knowing that she had won not through violence or chaos, but through the simple, inescapable truth of blood. From that moment on, every sunrise carried the weight of what they could no longer unlearn. Hope's gratitude turned to grief, Finn's compassion curdled into self-loathing, and the hospital that once symbolized healing became the birthplace of their tragedy. They would both go on, breathing, existing, fulfilling their duties, but the connection that had once felt pure now burned like a scar neither could erase. And in the quiet of the night, when the city slept and the monitors in the ICU blinked like distant stars, Finn would close his eyes and hear Sheila's voice again, whispering from the shadows, "You can't run from what's inside you." He knew she was right. Neither of them could. Because in the end, truth, like blood, always finds its way home. Sheila's tears were unlike anything Finn had ever seen before, not manipulative this time, not calculated or theatrical, but raw, trembling, almost childlike. For once, the monster looked human. She sat hunched in the corner of the room, her face buried in her hands, the sound of her sobs echoing through the hollow space between them. The confession slipped out not in the tone of triumph he had always feared, but in defeat, like a wound reopening after years of denial. She said she had loved a man she could never have, that he belonged to another world, and that her obsession had ruined not just his life, but every life that touched hers. She spoke of deceit, how she had hidden Finn's true paternity not to protect him, but to protect herself. The man she named, the one who had fathered both Finn and Hope, was a name that detonated through Finn's mind like shrapnel. It wasn't Jack. It wasn't anyone he had expected. It was someone whose life had ended in violence, someone Sheila herself had once been accused of killing. And as she cried, Finn felt the world splinter into unbearable fragments. He wanted to scream that it wasn't possible, that she was lying again, that this was just another one of her twisted manipulations. But her tears weren't for show this time. There was no glimmer of the predator in her eyes, only the hollow reflection of guilt. Sheila Carter, his mother, the woman he had spent his life fearing and hating, was confessing to a truth that tied her crimes together with his very existence. The realization left him hollow. She hadn't just killed people, she had murdered trust, identity, and belonging. Every sin she had committed had carved its way into his blood, into the person he had become without knowing it. Outside the quiet walls of that confession, the news of the DNA results had already escaped the hospital corridors. Whispers turned to headlines, and within hours, Los Angeles was buzzing with disbelief. Hope Logan and Dr. John Finnegan, half-siblings by blood. Connection traced to Sheila Carter. The word spread like wildfire, igniting every dormant resentment, every half-forgotten scandal. Brooke was the first to feel the tidal wave of conflicting emotions crash through her. Her daughter was alive because of Finn's quick decision, because of the blood he had given without hesitation. Gratitude filled her heart when she thought of that moment, her child's pulse returning under the same hands that had delivered countless patients from the edge of death. But gratitude gave way to horror when she learned whose blood it truly was. The same lineage that had once terrorized her family now pulsed through her daughter's veins. Brooke felt the familiar tightening of dread, the kind that came when old sins refused to stay buried. Yet despite the shock, she could not bring herself to hate Finn. She saw in him what few others could, a man trapped between two worlds, fighting the darkness he inherited. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw sincerity, remorse, the desperate desire to undo the past. He had risked everything to save Hope, and no revelation could erase that truth. Brooke found herself defending him publicly, even as the whispers around town grew vicious. "He's not her," she told anyone who would listen. "He's not Sheila." But the world doesn't easily separate blood from behavior, and soon, the gossip began to paint Finn as the latest victim of his mother's curse. Steffi, however, could not find such forgiveness so easily. When she first heard the news, her hands went cold, her heart turning to ice in her chest. Her husband, the man she had built her life around, the father of her children, was now bound by blood to one of her family's greatest enemies. But that wasn't what broke her. It was what came next. The full scope of Sheila's confession reached her through the police reports. Sheila had killed Finn's biological father years ago, unaware she was ending the life of the man who had given her a son. And Jack, the man who had raised Finn, had helped cover it up, pretending to be the father to protect his own reputation. Both of Finn's parents, one by blood, one by choice, were murderers. Steffi couldn't breathe when she heard it. The walls of the Cliff House seemed to close in on her, every memory of their family flashing through her mind like scenes from a tragedy she hadn't realized she was starring in. How could she explain this to her children when they grew older? That their father's very existence was born from violence, from lies, from murder? She looked at Finn differently now, not with disgust, but with sorrow so deep it bordered on despair. She still loved him, but love felt suddenly fragile, fragile against a truth that carried so much destruction. Finn, meanwhile, had withdrawn completely. He couldn't stand the way people looked at him now, with pity, fear, or curiosity. He had spent his life saving lives, trying to be the antithesis of his mother's darkness. Now, every achievement, every act of compassion, seemed tainted by a legacy he had never chosen. He spent nights pacing, hearing Sheila's confession replaying in his mind, hearing Steffi's voice cracking when she whispered that she didn't know who he was anymore. The guilt was unbearable. He began to believe that maybe the curse everyone whispered about was real, that no matter how hard he tried to rise above it, the blood that ran through him would eventually drag him down. Hope, too, was unraveling. The shock of discovering she was connected to Finn had barely settled before the rest of the truth hit her. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without seeing traces of Sheila, the woman who had nearly destroyed her family. She found herself withdrawing from everyone, even from her mother, who tried desperately to console her. Brooke's every attempt to comfort only made it worse, because Hope saw the same fear flicker behind her mother's eyes, the fear that evil was hereditary, that some stains never washed out. When Brooke finally came to visit Finn at the hospital, she found him sitting alone in the empty staff lounge, staring out the window into the city lights. She told him she didn't blame him, that none of this was his fault. But Finn barely heard her. He was thinking of his mother, locked away somewhere, her tears drying into silence, and of the life he had built now crumbling beneath the weight of her sins. He wanted to believe Brooke's words, but the echoes of his lineage screamed louder. How could he heal others when he couldn't heal himself? Meanwhile, Sheila sat in a holding cell, her hands trembling as she stared at the cold concrete floor. Her confession had freed her from years of secrets, but condemned her to a deeper kind of torment. She had wanted to protect Finn once. At least that's what she told herself, but every act of protection had turned to poison. When the detective asked her why she had finally confessed, she simply said, "Because he deserves to know who he is before he becomes like me." It was the first honest thing she had said in years. Days turned into weeks, and the town remained divided. Some saw Finn as a victim of circumstance, others saw him as a ticking bomb. Brooke stood by him publicly, defending his integrity. Steffi, torn between love and fear, began to question whether their family could survive under the shadow of such a legacy. And Hope, still healing from her injuries, carried the weight of a secret connection that she wished she could erase. In the quiet aftermath, Finn found himself standing outside the hospital late one night, looking at the same stars that once comforted him. But now they felt distant and different. He realized then that no matter how far he ran, he could never fully escape Sheila's shadow. Yet within that despair, a strange resolve began to form. Maybe redemption wasn't about escaping the past. Maybe it was about confronting it, about proving that one's blood does not define one's soul. Inside her cell, Sheila pressed her palms together and whispered his name, a prayer or a curse. No one could tell which. And somewhere across town, Steffi lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the man beside her was still the same one she had married. The truth had changed everything, but one thing remained certain. No one in Los Angeles would ever look at Finn, Hope, or Sheila the same way again. The revelation had not only rewritten their histories, it had cracked open the fragile illusion that blood could ever be